If you don't know your enemy, then there's no way you're going to win a battle with him. Welcome back, guys. It is part 2 of our series on who is Satan. In this video, we're going to go over 3 things, and that is the names or references to Lucifer, Leviathan, and Hades. So if you watched my first video in the series, I encourage you to do that. It was an overview of Satan in the Bible and ideas about him, and we found out that there's so many different titles that people take to mean Satan, so many references and different things, that we needed to kind of vet those out. And so what we're doing in these videos, and with these 3 names, Lucifer, Leviathan, and Hades, we're going to continue to vet these names against the Bible and against other ancient sources, so we understand what was meant by each of these names, and if they all meant the same thing, or they meant different things, or what. So that is where we are. Thank you for coming back for part 2. Let me pull up the slides and start. Part 2 is about Lucifer, Leviathan, and Hades. So let's get into it. We are searching now for research on Lucifer. What do the ancient writings say about him? What does the Bible say about him? We're going to get into all of that. So in the Bible, we only find the word Lucifer one time in the Bible, and that is in Isaiah 14. And so here is that section in Isaiah. And I pulled out a few verses, but these are the main ones. Just so you know, in verse 4, he talks about the king of Babylon. That's what the context is of this. It's a prophecy against this king of Babylon. Thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. And then in verse 12, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So that is the passage. There's more, obviously. You can read that whole chapter for yourself. But this is the only mention of the word Lucifer. Now, Christians have taken this word and used it to mean Satan throughout the years and centuries. So we can't discount that, but we have to really look at what this might truly mean. So the word Lucifer, is from the Latin lux, L-U-X, or light is what that literally means. Literally, the term means bearer of light. So as a term for this, quote, king of Babylon, obviously that's a descriptive term, bearer of light, somehow bright, light, whatever. It is synonymous, the word Lucifer is synonymous with a term used for Venus in the ancient world, the morning star. It was used by early Christian scribes. So when they came across this in the translating of the Old Testament, they tried to figure out a term that worked, and for them, this one made sense. But Lucifer was not in the original. Light bearer was, all right? So that's where that came from. That's the history of that word. But in studying all this, there's a little background that you might want to look into about, and I mentioned that here in Deuteronomy 32:8, but Lucifer was not the human king of Babylon. That's why God said, you were in the garden with me, you were in the heights with me, but you will be brought down as a man. He was the angel king of Babylon. You see, all the nations, in my 4th point there, all the nations were divided after the Tower of Babel. And when that happened, it's even mentioned in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, and that will make sense if you read it in the Septuagint. But the nations were split among the number of the sons of God. And that verse reads a little differently in different translations because they didn't understand why it said sons of God there. So they translated it sons of Israel in some, sons of the children of Israel, sons of this, sons of that. But it truly means sons of God, and those are the angels. So the nations were divided amongst the angels in Deuteronomy 32:8. This angel king of Babylon was one of these angel principalities put over the nation of Babylon. It was not the physical king, not the human king. He was a fallen angel, as stated in Isaiah 14, verse 12, that we read. He fell out of the heights. He was no longer in the heights of heaven. Many prophecies in the Old Testament are about these angel principalities. So we have a few, like the king of Tyre we had read in our previous video. The king of Tyre is also another one that most scholars don't know what to do with because they don't understand this angel principality concept that God divided the nations among these angels. And so the king of Tyre is exactly the same as the king of Babylon. They're both these angel deities. And that's why the prophecies were against the angel powers over these nations, because they had ruled wickedly. It wasn't always the human king that God was mad with, but the angel king behind him was the one that God had to do with. And that was bringing the wrath of God on those nations, because they didn't deal justly with their people or with God's people, Israel, when he dispersed them to those nations. So then there was judgment God was going to bring on them. And you can see that all through Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. When God talks about these different nations, he says, you did not treat my people correctly. You did not deal with them justly. Instead, you beat them, you He fills in the blank. That's what all that's about. But for instance, the king of Tyre, who many say is Satan because they don't have this background, is another mention of this type of thing. But Lucifer, then, is not Satan. He is this angel ruler over Babylon. And Satan was not one of these angel rulers, as we may see further in our study. But this was not an entity called Satan. Lucifer was a different being. So now that kind of fleshes Lucifer out. But now we're going to look into Leviathan. What do the ancient writings say about Leviathan? You've probably heard the term before. In the Bible, we're going to look at these references. First from Job 41. This is probably the most well-known. When someone says Leviathan or Behemoth, you immediately think of the narrative in Job because that's where it's mainly talked about. But in Job 41, chapter 41, 13 and 14, thou didst divide the sea by thy strength, thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters, thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat for the people inhabiting the wilderness. And so you can find that there and more. There's a whole descriptive of Leviathan, which we don't need to go into. In general, it says he's huge and strong and powerful. And it makes him sound like a beast, a monster, an animal. In Psalm 104, we have verses 25 and 26. So is this great and wide sea, wherein are things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. So there again, a mention of Leviathan when the sea is mentioned. So obviously, through both of these references mentioning the sea with Leviathan and, dragon or, beast, or you can start to make some assumptions about the nature of Leviathan and his association with the waters. In Isaiah 27, verse 1, it says, in that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay that dragon that is in the sea. So this saying that at some day, that great day, the Lord would slay Leviathan. And just so you have this side note, if you go to these verses, your translation most likely may not use the word Leviathan in the places you see it here. But if you look at the original Hebrew, you will see that word. And it is like Livy, Thion. And it's but you'll see that. It's just our English translations, they didn't know what to do with the word, and they didn't understand what it was. So they translated a different way to try to make it modern, and sound right to a 21st century reader. So I encourage you, if you do read these verses and you're looking for that word Leviathan, you may need to check your interlinear Hebrew to actually see that word used. Now, in other sources outside the Bible, we also find writings about Leviathan. So in the book of Enoch, chapter 60, which is also, that chapter is part of a section called the book of Noah. In verse 7, 9, and 24, we read this: "And on that day there were two monsters parted, a female monster named Leviathan, to dwell in the abysses of the ocean over the fountains of the waters. And I besought the other angel that he should show me the might of those monsters." And the other monster, by the way, that Leviathan was separated from, being Behemoth. I think that's mentioned in verse 8, which I didn't show here. But in verse 9 there, "I besought the other angel that he should show me the might of those monsters, how they were parted on one day, and cast the one into the abysses of the sea, the other into the dry land of the wilderness." See, Leviathan was cast into the sea, and Behemoth into the wilderness. Verse 24, "And the angel of peace who was with me," and this is Enoch speaking, obviously, "said to me, These two monsters, prepared conformably to the greatness of God, shall feed." And then this is a fragment of text, and I think part of it came from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's very fragmented. There's parts missing. And so this statement ends right there, but I just wanted to include it to show the mention of Leviathan and Behemoth. Again, pinning Leviathan to the abyss or the oceans, and pinning Behemoth to the land, calling both beasts or monsters. Now remember that word, monsters. It's a different word than we're going to hear from other things that talk about either Satan or these other entities. And so there seems to be a difference here with Leviathan. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, another old ancient Jewish writing, but in the Christian time frame, so this was post-Christ, in verse 6 it says, "I," and the "I" is Joel, an angel speaking in the context. I didn't include all that. You can't read through the whole thing. But he says, "I, Joel, am ordered to restrain the Leviathan." Joel claims in this passage, by the way, to be one of the archangels or highest level of angels surrounding God's throne with special jobs and duties, including restraining Leviathan and a few others like that. Verse 31 there says, "And I saw the sea and its islands, its monsters and fishes, and Leviathan and his dominion, and his camping ground and his caves, and the world that lay above him, his movements, and the destructions of the world on his account." So from this passage, just briefly, again, Leviathan is in the abyss, in the sea. And his dominion sounds from this passage like it is below the world, meaning where humankind lives. It is below that. And his movements and destructions were seen of the world on his account. So somehow he had some effect on the earth, but his dominion, his domain was below mankind's, in the abyss. Now in Jewish rabbinic legend, we have more information. A Jewish rabbinic legend describes a great battle which would take place at the end of time, where it says, "They will interlock with one another and engage in combat. With his horns the behemoth will gore with strength, and the Leviathan, the fish, will leap to meet him with his fins, with power. Their creator will approach them with his mighty sword and slay them both. Then, from the beautiful skin of the Leviathan, God will construct canopies to shelter the righteous, who will eat the meat of the behemoth and Leviathan amid great joy and merriment." So an amazing Jewish legend, rabbinic legend, that, it's hard to pin down these things sometimes as to whether they are truly from sources that are ancient or whether they were just stories that were told through time. But I do tend to take these kind of rabbinic writings and thoughts as at least mainstream thought at the time they were written in Jewish circles. in some regard. So we can at least know that these stories about Leviathan and Behemoth were told in Jewish tradition, whether they were 100% true or not, or from some writing that's we now don't have a copy of. This is interesting and at least should be considered as information, that there is this thought, and this is actually echoed in other passages too, but that there is at the end of either the age or the end of time that Behemoth and Leviathan would be engaged in battle, and God would slay both, and God would use the meat for the feeding of the righteous. And that statement there leads me to think that is the righteous in heaven, after he has had redeemed those righteous from Hades. And we will talk more about some of those concepts in further videos. But just to know, that is part of Jewish legend. Now, a little thing that I noticed as I really was studying Leviathan and Behemoth, when I heard and read about Leviathan and Behemoth, the two beasts that were from the sea and the land, it struck a note with me. It raised my antennas, because if you've read a lot of Revelation, then you know that that is the nature of the two beasts mentioned in Revelation. If you remember in Revelation chapter 13, there's two beasts, not just one, but there's two. The first beast in verse 1 of chapter 13 is the beast from the sea, and he has multiple heads with the name of blasphemy. And then in verse 11, a second beast is talked about, and this beast is out of the earth, has horns like a lamb, and spake as a dragon. So, when I saw that and heard, and just in thinking about the Leviathan and the Behemoth, the sea, the land, and then these two beasts were sea and land, at least it struck a chord with me. I will say that I was not able to vet that thought out. Like, I did research, I could not find the end of, is there some real live connection between Leviathan and or Behemoth and either of these beasts? And other than the sea and the earth, I couldn't make another connection in any writing. So I just wanted to bring that out, that, you know, maybe there's a relationship between these beasts in Leviathan and Behemoth and then in Revelation, but maybe that's something you can search out if you know sources to look at. I couldn't find any further information on that. It's just an idea at this point. So in summary on Leviathan, these points. Leviathan is a spiritual beast, dragon, of the primordial waters spoke of in Genesis 1:1 and verses 6 through 11. So if you remember in Genesis, there are what many call primordial waters. It says there were waters, and that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of these waters, the deep. And then it says in verses 6 and 7 that he separated the waters from the waters and created the land between. And so these are what we call the primordial waters in the circles of scholarship, because they were, the ancient waters before the creation, right? And it is said that Leviathan and Behemoth existed at that time. Creations nonetheless, but in those, that Leviathan was part of this abyss of primordial water, this chaos that was before creation. And then the second point, Behemoth is the counterpart, direct counterpart to Leviathan, said to be separated from him, as we read, and associated with the land and the earth, while Leviathan is associated with the sea. These beasts or monsters would be defeated by God and possibly fed to the saints in the end times, whether you see that as the end of the Jewish age perhaps, or the end of it could have been the end of the age of sin, which was before the flood. It could have been also, because that's when Enoch was written, right? It also could be the end of the world, the end of time. That's a question that I'll leave out there for you, but that was the thought in Jewish lore. And then angels were never called monsters. This is a point I just wanted to bring out. As I said, we had the mention that these beasts were monsters in I think a couple different passages in different writings. And so to say they're monsters kind of separates them from angels, because angels are never called monsters, all right? Even from the angels of the underworld to the highest cherubim and seraphim, none of them are ever called monsters. So it makes it hard for me to make the leap saying that, yes, these beings were the angel called Satan, or the angel called this, or the angel called that, because the word monster is just never used for angel in any of the writings that I've read. And I've read a lot of them. So it is a red flag to me that they are not that. But it's possible. It's just not, to me, not likely based on what I'm reading. I find it unlikely that Leviathan is an angel being, or that he is equivalent to Satan. So that's just my idea on the matter. You may come up with your own in your own study. Now, searching for the term or name Hades, what do the ancient writings say about Hades? So, first off, in the Bible, Matthew chapter 11, verse 23, "And thou, Capernaum, which art exalted to heaven, shall be brought down to Hades." This is obviously talking about the underworld portion of the underworld called Hades. There is both a place and an entity called Hades. So we will see that in just a second. In Luke chapter 16, "It came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell," this word actually in Greek is Hades, "he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom." So this Abraham's bosom is a place known throughout Judaism from time immemorial. Every writing you see on it is that it is a place inside of Hades, a container, if you will, where the righteous were kept, the righteous that died of mankind from Adam all the way till the coming of Christ, where they were held until the time of the Redeemer, which was Jesus Christ himself. That's all through Jewish history and lore and messianic tradition. And so that is a thing. It's real. And Abraham's bosom is the name they used for this place. And this is in the book of Enoch as well, mentioned, this place, if you want to read about it there. But just so you know, this mention in verse 23 of hell is actually Hades. And so this saying that Abraham's bosom is a part of Hades, it is where the dead go after they die. Revelation chapter 20, now we have a mention of Hades that is actually a personification of an entity. Verse 14 there, "And death," which is Thanatos in the Greek, "and hell," which is Hades in the Greek, "were cast into the lake of fire." This is the second death. So here, you can read through all of Revelation 20 if you want. This is the only verse that talks about Hades, but it is a specific reference to a entity, not a place. He didn't throw the underworld into the lake of fire. The lake of fire was a part of the underworld, but he threw Thanatos, which is an entity we're going to look at in our other videos, and Hades, which is another angelic entity, the ruler or caretaker of the place called Hades, and they were cast in Revelation 20, verse 14, into the lake of fire. So in other Greek sources, I went looking in Greek sources because the Greek mythology is full of these things and was active at and before the time of Christ when the New Testament was written. So these would be relevant references to these terms to help us understand the understanding they had at the time. Why would God give John a vision and have him use the terms Thanatos and Hades if they didn't know what they meant? Well, they did know what they meant, and these Greek sources are where they got that. So I looked through a bunch of Greek sources, found a great website resource, and I'll try to post as many links as I can in my description for you. But Euripides in the 5th century BC, Homer's Odyssey in the 8th century BC, Aristophanes' Birds in the 4th century, and these are all BC, before Christ, and then Virgil's Aeneid in the 1st century BC. So all of these between 100 and 800 years before Christ. These are old Greek writings. And if you've done any study of the mythology of the Greeks and the Titans and the Olympians and the gods, you will have seen all the parallels I see with the angelic realm, and that these may not necessarily have been complete mythology in the sense of them just being stories, but they may have referred to real beings. Perhaps some of the stories were stories, but these were known entities. I mean, for heaven's sakes, they worshipped these entities. They weren't, to these people, they were not made up stories or made up entities, at least. So in these sources, these Greek sources, looking for Hades, I found these points over and over and over again. I mean, lots of references, not just one or two. This is exactly what they believed. That Hades was, number one, the holding place of dead human spirits. Period. It was. But that also Hades was the keeper, point two, of the underworld. The phantom realm, they called it. The realm of the dead. Both the righteous and the unrighteous, the wicked, they went there. And then Hades was the caretaker or the keeper of this underworld place where those spirits went. And that he, meaning Hades, in this last point, rules the shades or the dark evil spirits of the underworld, and they serve him and do his bidding. He rules this area of the underworld called Hades. Hades is its ruler and has command over these evil spirits that live there and do his bidding. So other sources, now the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Gospel of Bartholomew, both Christian writings in the first couple centuries after Christ. Actually, I believe they're probably in the first century, but you know, it's so old, scholars have a hard time and they don't want to pin things down. These are very early Christian writings, very early. In the Gospel of Nicodemus, in the portion called the Descent into Hell, it's the second portion of the writing, chapter 5, verse 1. And as Satan the prince and Hades spoke this together, suddenly there came a voice as of thunder, and a spiritual cry, Remove, O princes, your gates, and be ye lift up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. When Hades heard that, he said unto Satan the prince, Depart from me, and go out of mine abode. So, a few things to remember about this, to realize in the context. And you need to read this book. If you haven't read the Gospel of Nicodemus, you need to read it. It talks about what happened when Jesus Christ died on the cross. Where did he go? In the 3 days he was dead before his resurrection, he went to Hades, and this is the story of what he did. He set the righteous free from Hades and took them to heaven at the end of this stint. But this is Satan and Hades talking, and they are both proper names. Satan talking to Hades. We already know Hades is the keeper of the underworld realm called Hades, and they are talking together because Christ is coming down into Hades, and they are afraid. They don't know what... Hades gets angry at Satan because he says, you don't even know what you're doing. You didn't know this was the Son of God. And it's the King of Glory. Anyway, it's an amazing story. You need to read it. But just to know, this mention of Hades is mentioned all through the book. I just pulled this one verse as an example, but Hades is a prime character in this writing, Gospel of Nicodemus. And in the Gospel of Bartholomew, it's very similar. That writing actually kind of echoes what Nicodemus's writing was. They both talk about this time when Christ was in the underworld between his death and resurrection for 3 days. And again, Hades is mentioned. Now, this is interesting because it's the same story, but Jesus says unto him in chapter 1, verse 11, Hades said unto Beliar, As I perceive, a God cometh hither. And the angels cried unto the powers, saying, Remove your gates, ye princes, remove the everlasting doors, for behold, the King of glory cometh down. Now, as you can recognize, this narrative is mirroring what we just read in Gospel of Nicodemus, Descent to Hell 5:1. It's the same narrative. The same thing is happening. Hades and Satan, but in Gospel of Bartholomew, Satan's named Beliar. All right, so now we have a clue, a connective tissue between the title Beliar and Satan that we're going to look into in a further video. We also know that Hades is not the same as Beliar or Satan. all right? Because of these passages. We know they're different entities. And so it's just amazing to me. I love these writings. I've read all of these, but I encourage you, again, read the Gospel of Bartholomew. It's not very long. Nicodemus is a little longer. Man, these are not big books. If you have the time and chance, read them. And then a writing called Josephus's Discourse on Hades. Now, there's some speculation that actually came late in the game from some scholars that say, oh, we don't think this is Josephus. We think it's Hippolytus, because they don't want to believe that Josephus could know this much about, Judaism. But anyway, there's a debate to go into on that. But this is called Josephus's Discourse on Hades. And in verse 3 of it, it says this: "For there is one descent into this region, at whose gate we believe there stands an archangel with a host, which gate when those pass through that are conducted down by the angels appointed over souls." So his discourse is on the arena of Hades, the realm of Hades. And he's talking about when men die, where do they go? And he's saying there's this region where there's a gate, and there stands an archangel with his hosts, and they control that gate. And those that pass through are conducted down by the angels that are over the souls of mankind. And so just a reference to Hades and that whole thing. Perhaps this archangel mentioned is Hades himself. At least there's a good possibility that's the case. But again, just this, seems like it's overwhelming that this Hades is a character, but this Hades is not Satan himself. So that is Lucifer, Leviathan, and Hades. Part 3, I think I got it wrong here. Part 3 is not Lucifer, Leviathan, Hades. Let me check real quick on my notes, so I can tell you for sure. Yeah, part 3, we're going to go into the names Thanatos, Abaddon, Samael, and Lilith. So stay tuned for that. Look for that video to come out. It'll probably be in another night, but I'm losing my voice for the first 2. But we will keep going. We've got 4 more videos. And it's all this diving into these different terms and names to see, do they reference Satan? Do they not? Are they the same? Are they different? And the next video being, again, Thanatos, Abaddon, Samael, and Lilith. So stick with me for that. Thank you for joining me for this part 2 of this 6-part series on Satan. And God bless. And give me a like and subscribe if you can. Thanks.